relationship with literature as a reader is bound up with my relationship with my mother. And my mother was a big reader of novels and love stories. And she took me to the library every week. And we would pick up books and take books back. And in those days, and still, the library is divided into sections. And one section is the adult section, and the other section is the children's section. And my mother would drop me off in the children's section, and then she would run to the adult section to get her novels. So that was just a big part of my life, that reading was a very feminine, womanly thing, and it was what women did. The other part of my life that was still, again, with reading, and I think it had a big effect on me becoming a storyteller. Like most parents, my mother read to us bedtime stories. And there were 4 children, and she had 3 children back to back, like 1, 2, and 3, and then another child later on. So at some point, I guess when I was around 8 years old, my mother got very, very tired and exhausted with some of her duties as a mother, and she turned over the reading of the bedtime stories to my brothers and sister to me. And so it became like my job at night to read my younger sister these fairy tales and these stories. And so I learned to read dramatically. I learned to read to really, kind of soothe my sister, who had a very hysterical, mean little personality. And I was reading her these stories, basically Grimm, Cinderella, Rapunzel, Snow White, the whole thing, Goldilocks. And I became like a storyteller in a certain kind of way, once I started reading, and once my mother started taking me to the library as a child, I never stopped. It just became like my favorite activity. And at some point, there was a change in my mother and my relationship, where she no longer had the freedom to read because her whole life was bound up in cooking and cleaning and everything. And she almost began to resent me going off to my room to read a book. She would say, "Where is she?" And the other kids would say, "She's in her room reading." And my mother said, "Get down here and help me clean and help me cook," and that type of thing. But once I discovered the magic of reading, I never gave it up, and I always was a reader. The first reading I did as a young child, 5 and 6 years old, were fairy tales, were Prince Charming, were, Snow White, Cinderella, all these blonde-haired, blue-eyed princess stories. So that was, what I was raised reading. So you can imagine my shock when I found out I didn't fit into the fairy tales at all. And then I started to read other kind of books, what we would call today young adult books, books of coming-of-age stories. I discovered, I just started reading things like Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, and then I moved on to, the Dickens novels and things like that. So it's very much the traditional literature. I remember in elementary school, we used to have to write little stories and things like that, but I didn't really take it seriously. And when I was in the 8th grade, I had a chance to, we had an assignment to write a story. And I remember the teacher's name. It was Mrs. Dukes. And I wrote the story, and it was a very traumatic experience for me, because when I handed in the story, she didn't believe that I had written it. It was so good, and the vocabulary was extensive, and her response was, and she said it in front of the class, she held up my story and she said, "You didn't write this." And I just remember the shock, I said, yes, I did write this. She said, and then she repeated again, "You didn't write this." And I think there was a little part of me that started to question myself. Maybe I didn't write this. You know what I mean? And then for a long time, that was in the 8th grade, I was 13 years old, I didn't write anymore. And I don't remember what it was that brought me back to writing, because, you know, I was always keeping little notes. So I don't think it was so much that I totally stopped writing as I stopped sharing what I was writing. You know, I didn't show it to people. I didn't take chances in class trying to write, you know what I mean? But I think the thing that brought me back was just friends, you know. Every now and then I would write something in a journal or write a little attempt at a poem, and I would say to a friend, listen to this. And they never said, we don't think you wrote it. They said, wow, we like that. We're feeling that, you know what I mean? And it was that kind of, those little wow, or we're feeling it, or you got something there, Sapphire. It just started to, like, the teacher put ice around my heart, and my friends they were the flame that melted the ice, you know, that let me believe in myself again. The first thing that I published was poetry. And how I even got to the place of publishing poetry was by reading poetry. So we start with the friends saying, yeah, that works, we like that. And then I go to readings, you know. Sometimes they were like what we used to call speak outs, where women would gather in nightclubs and coffee houses, and we would be writing poems about the experiences of our life. And my friends would start going, get up there, you belong up there. And I was just like, yeah. And then they would just keep, you know, going at it. And I would just all of a sudden find myself up in front of a group of people reading my poems. And then the poem is over and they're clapping. And I'm just like, yeah, I wrote that. I did that. That was me. And then out of that experience, and I started doing that a lot all around, you know, town, people would come up to me afterwards and they would say, you know, I'm the editor of a journal. I would love to publish that poem that you just read. And that was how I first got published, you know, just speaking my poems, the spoken word movement, and then people coming up to me afterwards asking me, is that poem available? And I would say, yeah, that poem is available. And I would send them the poem, and that was really how I first got published. And I had never even thought of writing a novel those first years. It was really about poetry, and it was really about the spoken word, you know, that whole movement of the spoken word. I choose the subject, but the subject has first chosen me. I choose the subject, but the subject has first chosen me. I felt limited in poetry, so I wanted to I was starting to write narrative poetry with characters and stuff like that, and it really was, the poetic form was limiting me, and I knew that I wanted to open up. I wanted to spend hours and hours creating a character. You know, I wanted to go deeply into character, and that's not what the medium of poetry is for. So while I may have explored the abused child in one poem, you know, short poem, I wanted to go in depth with that subject, and I needed a novel to be able to do that. The process of putting together a book of poetry is so intense. So you're reading the poem over and over again, then you send it to your editor, they send it back to you, then you send them the second poem, and you're starting to put that collection together. So you're reading it over and over again. And then when you publish the book, you're out on tour and you're reading from the book. And then at some point, a year or so goes by, and you close that book and you put it on the shelf and you start writing the other book. And that can, then you have a tendency not to read that book again. I recently read over my second book of poetry, and I hadn't read that book for maybe 4 or 5 years, and it was amazing to me. I had lost contact with the self that had written that book. The book was published in 1999, so that was some time ago. And so it was startling almost to see this is where my mind was. This is where my creative process was. These were my obsessions, and some of them are things that I'm not even thinking about anymore. This was the level of my craft. It was the very best work I could do, but I was looking at it very critically, and thinking, I wish that I could have had 5 more years to work on all those poems to take them to another level. But you only have the time you have, So it's been, it's almost a humbling experience sometimes to go back and read what you wrote years and years ago. When I am writing poetry, I am really concerned with both aspects, the structure and the content. The nature of poetry is that it is a musical art. It is, it is about rhythm. It is about, sound. So you have to, if you're not concerned with the structure of poetry, you're really not really concerned with poetry. It's like saying, being a musician saying, I'm just concerned with the content of the lyrics. I don't care how they sound. So sound is very important in making a poem. So I'm really concerned with the structure. I'm constantly trying to learn more about structure, the metrical aspects of poetry, certain forms of poetry. And with the novel, I'm still concerned with structure, the beginning, the middle, the end, how you're going to build a scene, how you're going to create and, paint a character and make them come alive. So structure is important to me. To have my novel adapted to a film was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. When I went to the theater for the first time to see a preview of the screening, I was very prepared for anything, including for it to be terrible. And when I sat there and saw what the director had done, when I saw what the actresses had done, I was amazed. I was amazed that they had taken one form, the novel, a small book, and they had opened it up to this big film, this big screen that was going to take it to millions of people. I was amazed and I was deeply touched. And I was amazed at how different the film was from the book and how different an art form film is from the novel. And I was happy. People kept asking me, was the film like the book? And I'm glad that the director created a whole new art form. You know what I mean? The film is a whole different art than the book. It's 2 different forms. You know what I mean? So it would have been silly for the film to be exactly like the book because we had the book. So I was I felt just very blessed with the film. My creative process is different depending upon what I'm writing. So how I begin with a novel is I think about the subject that I'm writing. I sometimes have made an outline. Sometimes I don't make an outline. Sometimes I've done a lot of research. Sometimes I do the writing and do the research later. But there is one kind of constant part of my process, and that is that I try to write in the morning, and I try to write the first thing in the morning, and I literally sometimes just wake up, and my desk actually is close to my bed, but sometimes I don't even get out of bed to get to the desk. I have a notebook by my bed, and I will just get up and I will just start writing. And sometimes at night I will have left in the notebook a suggestion. when you wake up, what you're going to write about is the character relationship with their mother, and specifically about the mother stealing some money from the girl, something like that. So I will already have planted the suggestion of what I'm going to write at night and kind of slept on it, and then wake up in the morning and just start writing that chapter. And with poetry, my process is very different. I can start a poem on the subway ride home, and by the end of the ride, and 45 minutes later, I've got my poem. You know what I mean? I may have to go home and rewrite it and work on it, but it's a very different process. And the poetry comes for me a lot faster, even though I may take that poem that it only took me 45 minutes to write and work on it for the next month. The process of writing the poem is much, much more compressed and and there's a lot more spontaneity in the actual writing of the poetry. I think of literature as being this great table, and many people are bringing many different creations to the table. The way I view my creations in relationship to other writers and other works of art around the world is that my work is, let's look at literature as a grand dinner party. There's an artist named Judy Chicago who presented a performance piece, an artist called an artwork called The Dinner Party. And so I think of literature as being this great table, and many people are bringing many different creations to the table. And so we have the great, Portuguese writers, we have the great English writers, we have the great American writers, we have little writers, big writers, people who have only written one book, people who have written hundreds of books, but we're all there adding our gift to the world, our meal for the world to feed off of, we're putting on the table. And so I'm a part of that process, you know what I mean? I'm certainly not the one who brought the giant turkey to the table, but I'm someone who has put something, who has made something out of their life and out of their work that other people can feed their heart with. I had taught a class at Trinity College on women, writing, and journals, and I had started to just read, not just the short work. I tried to get a lot of Catalina de Jesus' work had been translated into English, so I got like the whole body of her work and a biography and her own extended biography, and I began to teach that work. And that work was actually, I had read The Child of the Dark years and years ago, and The Child of the Dark in some ways was this woman who is taking pieces from the trash and writing her life. It also becomes an inspiration for my own work when I was writing the novel Push. My relationship as a writer with the reader in some ways begins while I'm actually writing. I'm thinking not about pleasing the reader or satisfying the reader, but I'm thinking about communicating with the reader. And I have a reader in my mind. It's not a man, it's not a woman, it's not black or white. It's someone who desperately wants the story that I'm writing. And I think of that reader as a magnet, and his or her desire for the story that I'm writing inspires me and pulls the story out of me in a certain kind of way. After the book is published, the reader becomes human. It's no longer a metaphorical reader. It's a human reader who can be hurtful at some point because they don't understand what you're trying to do, and they can also be like just kind of a lightning bolt to your heart, where you have that instant communication, where they got it, where they appreciate it, they understood what you were trying to do, and you've made the connection that you wanted to make. But the reader is ultimately, it's the reader, not the critics, it's the reader that keeps the book alive. And you want, as an author, you want your work to live. So in some ways, we're not, writing letters or journals that are private. As writers, as artists, we are ultimately trying to communicate with that reader. And if we miss that communication, we've missed the point in some ways. The importance of the literary critics we can't discount the literary critic, no matter how much we may want to, the writer may want to. The literary critic is often the first person who is going to have contact with the book. They're going to be the ones who are going to review it for newspapers, for magazines. So in a certain kind of way, they can affect who your reader is going to be, or if you're going to have readers. If the reviews are bad enough and the readers are not courageous enough to go beyond the review, you may not have any reader. And sometimes the critics can be very hurtful, and sometimes they can be very helpful. Sometimes they can help the reader get to the work, and sometimes they can keep the reader away from the work. So you have a very contentious relationship with the critics. The importance of literary festivals like the one that I'm a part of right now is it gives us a chance to connect immediately with the reader, immediately to connect with other writers in the flesh, you know what I mean? So all of a sudden, it gives us an opportunity to go beyond the critics, to go beyond the newspaper, and to present ourselves and to present our work to other common souls, to other people who are like us. So it becomes really important in terms of breaking down isolation. So the writer suffers maybe more from isolation than any other artist. The musician works in concert with other musicians. The dancer works on the stage with other dancers. But the writer sits in a room alone, creating this work, and a lot of times we don't know other writers unless we're very gregarious or we're, teaching with them. And so there's an opportunity, if you use it when you come to places like this, to really connect with other writers, to connect with people who you have never even dreamed of reading your text. It's like, to me, a big opportunity to break isolation and connect with other human beings, around their art, around your art, to connect with your readers, they want to take selfies with you, they want to hug you. It's a good feeling, and I let myself have it, The advice I would give to a person who's starting out as a writer is, the first thing would be, don't give up. There's going to be so many times when you just feel futile and you receive a negative criticism, or your friends don't understand what you're trying to do. I would say, don't give up. Persistence, persist, endure, and you will create something meaningful if you don't give up. You know what I mean? So that would be my first bit of advice. And then the other bit of advice is to be leery of advice, be leery of, be careful of the advice that you take, and begin to make your own path and to find your own way, and to kind of almost dedicate yourself to finding your own voice. There's a poet, Jane Cortez, who is a fantastic African-American poet, and she has a poem dedicated to young people, and it's very simple. It says, find your own voice, and use it. Find your own voice and use it. So those would be my words.